coming up next, we have Dr. Kerri Muller, and Kerri is the principal ecologist and an expert in constructed wetlands. She's part of our expert team here at Water Sensitive South Australia, so we're very lucky to have her as part of our team. And her passion for bridging the gap between science, policy, and practice has enabled her to deliver many creative solutions to long term and short term environmental challenges in natural resources management and aquatic systems. Kerri is going to share with us today more about the impacts of sediment on water sensitive urban design and assets. Thank you, Kerri. Welcome.
Thank you, Belinda. I'm coming to you from Nurringerry, really, which is Victor Harbour, for those of you that know Victor Harbour, and I note that's where the next STRAIN conference is, so I better put in my abstract. So what I want to talk to you about today is sediments and WSUD. So what we've just heard about is the sediments that are released when there's disturbance of soils in the catchment. So we can have sediments being released anywhere within the catchment. So all of our WSUD elements are pretty much at risk from sediment, even though we are building them to collect sediments in the first place. So what we ideally have is a chain of WSUD water quality improvers throughout the catchment. And each of those WSUD elements in that chain is providing us with ecosystem services, and it contributes to the overall natural capital of our environment. But probably the most important thing to say right now is when you look at that picture of Adelaide, that whole grey area was wetlands 200 years ago. The whole of that green area was covered pretty much in forests and grasslands. So we have got a lot less ecosystems in our catchment trying to provide a greater level of service, because we are providing them with higher levels of sediment and other pollutants than what they would have coped with naturally, and we have a lot less of them in the system. So as sediment moves through a catchment, it behaves differently. I'm not a fluvial geomorphologist, so this is the ecologist view of sediment flowing through a catchment. Basically, the heavy stuff falls to the bottom and the lighter and more dissolved stuff stays in suspension. So obviously that can change with slope, with the hydraulics of your system, but generally speaking, sediments are deposited or they're suspended, and obviously that resuspension can happen throughout the system. So just because something's deposited somewhere doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. It can be resuspended and move through the system again. Now, as I said, we build WSUD elements to capture sediment, and different WSUD elements have different sedimentation capacity. This comes from the South Eastern Council's work that was done by Melbourne Water. And if you're looking for any guidelines or any technical drawings or those sorts of things, Melbourne Water's website is a fantastic place to have a look. So if we have a look at this, really what I want to pull your attention to is the particle size removal that we can see there. So most of our WSUD elements are fairly good at the coarse, medium and the fine sort of stuff, but that's not to say that they're not being resuspended within the WSUD, but they are good at capturing those things in the first place. The finer the particles, the less easy it is, and they tend to pass through some of our WSUD elements and remain in suspension. Constructed wetlands that are well designed and that have good maintenance and good macrophyte zones will take out some of those finer particulates and hopefully won't see them resuspended. But as I say, the sediment can be released anywhere. So any WSUD anywhere is at a risk from being overloaded as the sediments move from their source all the way through to the sea. So that means that we can get reduced performance, and it also accelerates the time that we need to do renewal activities, maintenance activities, all those other things that we need to spend money on. Unfortunately, what happens in reality is some of our WSUD elements, instead of being sediment sinks, end up becoming sediment sources. And so they're actually releasing sediment into the catchment. So if we think of our WSUD element, it's sitting somewhere in a catchment. We've built it deliberately to provide us with ecosystem services. And today we're talking about sediment removal, but obviously there's a whole range of ecosystem services that each WSUD provides. So that could be swales, it could be buffers, biofilters, rain gardens, sediment basins, constructed wetlands. Obviously sediment basins are specifically designed to act as that trap within the catchment, and to be hopefully easily cleaned, and have that sediment removed. So if we think about WSUD sitting in a catchment, it's an urban catchment, it's not what it was, and we are hoping that it's going to be better in the future. So we build our WSUD element to remove sediment. Excuse me. Within that WSUD element itself, there's a whole lot of ecosystem services going on, and they are provided by the components. So that's the plants, the microbes, the fungi, the biofilms, all that sort of stuff, and also by the processes such as sedimentation, deposition, same kind of diff, and erosion. So there's a whole lot of things going on. Some of those services are the things that we want that WSUD to provide us. So that's filtering out sediments, that's trapping sediments, that's dealing with nutrients and pollutants so that it greens and purifies our water as it moves through the catchment. Some of the things going in our WSUD are going to be at risk, are going to increase the risk profile to water coming out of that WSUD. So there can be disturbance within the WSUD itself, particularly high flows can come through and redistribute sediments and resuspend the fines that have dropped out during the lower flow periods. So we get that erosion happening within the WSUD element itself, and which can then transport sediments. The nutrient profile can actually, we can actually end up with greater nutrients in the water column as it moves through a WSUD, depending on the substrates that are being used, and also the nutrient loads that are coming into there, and how well the balance between plants and microbes is managed within that system. And obviously they also evaporate. Well, some WSUD elements allow for evaporation, such as constructed wetlands, and so you can get an increase in the actual concentrations of these pollutants within the WSUD element. So ideally, our WSUD element acts as a sediment sink. We have an easy to clean out sediment trap, which we take that sediment out, we follow the guidelines, and we dispose of it appropriately, and we understand that it's probably got pollutants in it. Some of that sediment is going to be suspended or resuspended within the WSUD element itself, and is just going to stay in that WSUD element. And that's particularly true of larger constructed wetlands, and unfortunately some where the clays that are used to line during construction of the wetland have come into suspension and have remained in suspension. So, you know, the substrates that we use in our constructed wetlands are very important for that. And I know we've learned a lot of lessons over time, and our designs are getting better and better. Unfortunately, sometimes a WSUD element can also become a sediment source. So you can deliver sediment to another WSUD, to rivers, lakes, wetlands, and the ocean, or to aquifers. What we're actually asking is our WSUD elements to be supernatural. So as I've said, the catchments have changed. The amount of area that we've dedicated to providing us with ecosystem services is much, much smaller, and we're giving them bigger jobs to do. So we really do expect our WSUDs to be supernatural, and it's really important that we look after them because they are doing a huge job for us. Now, when it comes to sediment, hopefully we have a really well-designed sediment basin like this one here, where you can access, come in here and you can access the sediment basin and remove the sediment so that then it's not moving through into the macrophyte zone. But obviously, if we get excess sediments, we are going to alter the hydraulics of our system. So the slopes and the levels can change, but also the preferential flow paths, which can lead to less treatment overall. We can get blockages in our structures, which then need to be maintained or sometimes rectified. Sometimes we can't operate structures because the sediment has built up around them, and so we can't transfer water through our WSUD asset in the way that we'd like to. We can get reduced infiltration, particularly in biofilters, where the substrate has been carefully engineered to enable that infiltration. If we get a lot of sediment clogging it up, that can just alter that infiltration capacity completely, or reduce that infiltration capacity, and then the biofilter is not doing what we wanted it to do. And as I say, we can get increased bypassing, particularly around GPTs, which are doing the job of trying to take out some of the gross pollutants, end up getting bypassed because the sediment's building up, altering the flow path around these things, and potentially also bypassing the macrophyte zones depending on how the wetland is managed and how it's designed. So we can end up with less treatment from our WSUD. We can also have less volume, so it's not providing that same flood mitigation capacity. And obviously with that, sedimentation basins being at the front end often of large wetland systems, that they have a big role to play in terms of flood mitigation, and we don't want them filling up the sediment and then having that water banking up into the catchment. Obviously, reduced pollutant removal, we can get release from the sediments, and we get this sort of unstable substrate where we've got erosion and deposition happening within the WSUD structure. Obviously, more so in our larger systems like constructed wetlands than in a smaller system. In terms of what the WSUD does biologically, it really overloads those workers that we've got in our WSUD system. So here I'm talking about the plants and the microbes that are doing the work. So we have reduced light penetration into the water. It's highly turbid, so it's murky. We get more oxygen demand, so we can have black water events potentially, which could lead to losses of fishes and other things in our systems. The increased nutrient loads that come with high levels of sediment, as we've just heard about from Kathy, and that smothering, particularly of plants and seeds, can reduce the habitat quality that we have, but also the density of our macrophytes, which are trying to do the job for us. So what we end up with is a dominance of algae and microbes. So as we have a more highly turbid and a more highly eutrophic, nutrient-dense system, we're more likely to have algae, and that will then reduce further the macrophytes that we actually want to grow. There are very, very few constructed wetlands that have macrophytes growing below the water surface, and this is due to high levels of disturbance. Most probably, I haven't researched it specifically, but when you look at these things, you can see that the plants that have been planted, so often we plant milfoils and things like that below the water level, but they don't persist because of high levels of turbidity, high levels of nutrients. They become smothered in algae, and so algae starts to dominate. For those of us that are lucky enough to have common carp in our systems as well, they will resuspend the sediments. So carp have a mumbling habit where they go along and they suck up and spit out the surface sediments. That destroys the macrophytes, but it also resuspends the sediments with all their nutrients and everything, and again leads to a dominance of algae. Sediments really limit aquifer recharge as well, whether that's a managed aquifer recharge system or if it's an aquifer storage and recovery system. Most of them will have automated sampling of some sort on them to sample the turbidity of the water. And this is often an EPA licensing requirement to stop turbid water being deliberately injected into the aquifer. So there will be injection targets for the aquifer, so that might be less than 20 NTU, which is the units that are used for measuring turbidity. It's basically how much light can pass through a water sample. So these systems will alarm if the NTU gets to a certain level, and then there'll be requirements to shut down to make sure that we're not getting turbid water into the aquifer. What this ultimately means is that we can't operate these really valuable assets as often as we would like to, because the sediment is either in the source water is not being effectively removed, or it's being resuspended in the wetland prior to injection. So we're not achieving our stormwater harvest potential. And obviously sediment impacts on people. None of us like looking at murky water. We get a reduced return on our natural capital investment that we've made, whether that's through our local government rates or through a grant that's paid for, or however that's done. We're not getting that natural capital return that we want on that investment. So there's more pollution and odours. There can be direct health risks associated with algae and pathogens in the water, and obviously increased costs for dealing with water as it moves from wherever that sediment has been mobilised through to the sea. One of the costs to people is that loss of productive soil from the landscape as it transitions from being productive soil to a nuisance sediment. And as I've said, we get a reduced lifespan of the WSUD, but we also have a less immersive experience when we go to a WSUD like a constructed wetland, which are often built for visual amenity and for recreation. We've found that people get increasingly concerned for nature, and there's more complaints about our wetland systems if they're highly turbid and full of litter and things like that. And it actually reduces the motivation for volunteers to get out there and be in those systems to do things like citizen science monitoring. So what do we need to do? So we need to design our WSUD based upon the inflows. And I think that was what Kathy wrapped up with there in her questions as well. If we understand the catchment, then we make sure that our WSUD is designed to be fit for purpose. We need to make sure our sediment traps are really easy to clean. We know that we're going to have to clean them often. We need to build that into our budgets so that we're out there and cleaning them. We need to understand what the actual hydraulics of our as constructed WSUD is, and then how we're going to maintain those hydraulics to keep our performance level as high as possible. And what the other side of that is that there's an actual water regime that each of those macrophytes within the system is experiencing. And that's the duration, the frequency, the timing, and the depth of water. And they can all be affected by sediment if we allow it to accumulate in our systems. And then we don't get the density or survival of macrophytes that we're looking for, and we probably get less diversity. And as I said before, operations and maintenance start to increase. So we want to make sure that if we're going to be successful at managing sediment, that we're managing it through that whole chain of WSUD through good maintenance and scheduling. I'm going to end with this message to everybody, and maybe a bit of a challenge, is to set yourself some WSUD targets for turbidity. If you're a WSUD manager, it's really important to get out there and have a look at what the quality of water moving through your system is. You can see here that the turbidity from clear to murky, sorry, I haven't got the NTUs on there, but you can easily collect a little sample in something like this, which is a turbidity tube. It has a Secchi disc on the bottom, and you just look through, you fill it up, and the more murky the water is, the less of it you need in that water column to prevent you from seeing that black and white disc at the bottom. So that's a measure of the light penetration, which is what turbidity is all about. So setting yourself some WSUD targets for turbidity is a really important thing, getting out there in different conditions, because as Kathy was saying, sediment liberation is a highly variable process. So we really need to understand what is going on with your WSUD. So to wrap it up, best practice, understanding your local sediment processes is really important. Preventing mobilisation, I think you've heard that message, it's the cheapest option. Having chains of WSUD, supernatural ecosystems sitting out there, they need love and attention. They need their sediment traps easily and regularly cleaned. They need to be monitored so that we understand our sediment loads and how those slugs of turbidity are moving through the system. We inspect them regularly, maintain and rectify. It's also really important, and particularly with biofilters, that we do our supplementary watering when it's needed to make sure that we keep the density of our macrophytes so that when those slugs of water come through, that they're able to do their job and filter out the system. And obviously this all needs to go through an asset condition assessment and move into our forward budgets. They're our program partners for Water Sensitive SA, but I also wanted to just point out before I hand back to Belinda that we are about to release our inspection and maintenance guidelines. So they'll be coming out next year. We're just doing the final technical edit on those, and we thank our partners around the nation who have provided us with technical input into those. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kerri. I have quite a few questions. There's quite a few questions on the chat line. I love the supernatural heroes analogy for WSUD. Struck a chord. However, people are quite interested in that link to your little
Yep.
economic highlights
Yep.
along the bottom of your presentation, Scanlan out, and just wondering if we can
Yeah,
provide a link.
absolutely. Yep, it's on the first slide where I had those little ticker strips going along the bottom. I put the full reference on that. So when you get our slides, you'll be able to see that. But yeah, I'll pop it up in the chat line as well.
Awesome. And just thinking about your slide where you had the particulate sizes and the different WSUD features that manage those best, it's quite interesting to note that those bioretention swales and constructed wetlands at either end sort of perform like at similar particulate removal or management. One's centralized, one's decentralized. So is that like in applying constructed wetlands in developed urban areas is quite difficult. So is the biofiltration swales the next best option if you've got to sort of squeeze them in to the urban environment?
Yeah, well, look, I guess it comes back to understanding what your sediments are that you're going to have. So if you are going to be in one of those sort of soil types where you're going to get a lot of liberation of fine sediments, then you need to be choosing the WSUD in the locations that's going to do the job for you. So you need, personally, I think we need to come through an ecosystem services lens. Sorry, that was my timer telling me that I'd finished talking. And if we come in through an ecosystem services lens when you're designing a WSUD, you say, well, what do I want this WSUD to do? And that's the first place to start, I guess, and understanding how the sediments move through the catchment, where they're liberated from, and what you need to do. So yes, I think the answer is it's a mixture, and it's very dependent on what your sediment profile is going to look like. And we know that's going to be highly variable. We know that those big slugs are the problems. So trying to get on top of those big slugs and preventing them from being mobilised wherever possible is the solution, I think.
Awesome. Some great takeaways there. Thank you so much, Kerri, for that.